Close this $900 million deal for me, and I'll marry you. That's what the CEO said, out loud, to the janitor. In front of 50 people, 2 foreign executives and a journalist with her phone already recording, the conference room smelled like espresso and expensive cologne. The fluorescent lights hummed above a long mahogany table where a deal worth nearly $1 billion was bleeding out. And in the middle of it all, a single father in a gray custodial uniform knelt on the floor with a rag in his hand, cleaning up someone else's spilled champagne, while a woman in a $5,000 suit turned him into the punchline of her evening. The room laughed. He said nothing. He finished wiping the floor. He stood up. He walked out. But here's what no one in that room understood yet. The janitor didn't flinch, not because he was used to being humiliated. He didn't flinch because he'd sat across the table from people who made that CEO look small. He'd closed deals in languages half that room couldn't name, and the way he stood up slowly, controlled, shoulders back, like a man conserving something dangerous one person in that room noticed. The CFO, she was the only one not laughing. She was watching his hands. Steady. Perfectly still. The hands of a man who had held much heavier things than a mop. 3 weeks later, that same janitor stood in that same conference room. But he wasn't cleaning the floor. He was speaking Portuguese. And the CEO who had mopped him couldn't move, couldn't speak, could barely breathe, because the man in the custodial uniform was doing exactly what she had dared him to do, and doing it better than anyone she'd ever hired. If you believe that the people the world overlooks are sometimes the most powerful ones in the room, stay with this story, because what happens next will leave you speechless. Before we begin, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments, have you ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who they were really talking to? But to understand how a janitor ended up saving a $900 million deal, we need to go back 3 weeks to a quiet apartment in Chicago, where a little girl was drawing skyscrapers at a kitchen table. The plastic grocery bags cut into his fingers as he climbed the stairs. 3rd floor, no elevator. The hallway smelled like old carpet and someone's garlic from 2 doors down. Ray Castillo shifted the bags to one hand and unlocked the apartment with the other. Inside, the kitchen table was covered in colored pencils. Sophia sat cross-legged on her chair, tongue pressed to the corner of her lip, dragging a blue pencil across a sheet of paper. She didn't look up when he came in. She was concentrating. Ray set the bags on the counter and started unpacking. Rice. Beans. A package of chicken thighs on sale. Half a gallon of milk. He put the rice on the stove and seasoned the chicken the way his mother used to garlic, cumin, a squeeze of lime, and slid it into the oven. Papa. He turned. Sophia held up her drawing. A tower. Tall and narrow, with rows of tiny windows all the way to the top. She'd drawn a flag on the roof, though he couldn't tell what it was supposed to be. "This one's yours," she said. "This is the building you're going to own." He walked over and took it from her, studied it the way she wanted him to, carefully, like it mattered. "It's the tallest one yet," he said. "I know." He opened the fridge and pinned it next to the others. There were dozens. Some had curled at the edges, some had faded from the light. Every single one was a skyscraper. They ate together at the cleared half of the table, Sophia's pencils pushed to the side. She told him about a girl at school who could hold her breath for 45 seconds. She told him her art teacher said she used too much blue. She told him blue was the best color and her art teacher was wrong. Ray listened. He nodded in the right places. He cut her chicken into smaller pieces without being asked. After dinner, he washed the dishes while she brushed her teeth. He read her 3 pages of a book about a girl who sailed across the ocean alone. Sophia's eyes were heavy by page 2, but she fought it until page 3. He pulled the blanket to her chin, kissed her forehead. "Locks on," he whispered to Mrs. Delgado at the door. The old woman waved him off the way she always did, one hand. No words, already settling into the recliner with her novella on low volume. The bus came at 9:38. Ray rode it 14 blocks south and walked the last two to Bellinger Shaw. The lobby was marble, cold and clean and polished to a shine that reflected the overhead lights like still water. Ray swiped his badge at the service entrance around back. The time clock read 9:57 p.m. He punched in, pulled his cart from the supply closet, and started on the 28th floor. He knew the building the way a surgeon knows a body. Which offices had carpet that held crumbs? Which partners left coffee rings on mahogany? Which ones dropped food wrappers behind their monitors thinking nobody would find them? He found them. Every night, he cleaned them and said nothing. On the 30th floor, he paused at a whiteboard in the open strategy room. Someone had written a column of figures, projected valuations, equity splits, a timeline marked in red. Ray's eyes moved across the numbers, the way a reader's eyes move across a sentence. Quickly, fluently. He caught an inconsistency in the third column, a decimal that didn't track. His hand drifted toward the board. He stopped, pulled it back, pushed his cart forward. In a corner office on the 31st floor, a framed diploma hung slightly crooked. MBA, Wharton School of Business. Ray straightened it with 2 fingers, aligning the bottom edge with the nail. He'd done it before. He'd do it again next week. Ray. Eddie appeared at the end of the hall, flashlight clipped to his belt. The security guard was the only person in the building who used his name. "You hear about this deal thing they got going?" "Heard a little," Ray said. $900 million. That's what they're saying. Eddie shook his head. "Brazilian company. Everyone's wound tight. I've been here 19 years, never seen them this nervous." Ray nodded. "People get nervous when there's money on the line. You got that right." Eddie tapped the wall twice and continued his rounds. Ray worked his way up, floor by floor, emptying trash cans, wiping glass, vacuuming in long, straight rows. The building was his between 10 and 6, all 40 floors, give or take. But nobody would ever describe it that way. To everyone who worked here during the day, the building was theirs. Ray just passed through it. At 2 a.m., he reached the 32nd floor. The executive level, corner offices, dark wood, the faint smell of leather and old paper. The conference room lights were on. Through the glass wall, Ray could see 7 people around the long table. Papers spread everywhere. A woman stood at the head, tall, sharp-shouldered, her posture rigid as a drawn blade. Catherine Bellinger. She was pointing at a man seated to her left. Her mouth moved fast. The man looked at the table. Ray didn't slow down, didn't stop. He pushed his cart past the glass, past the muffled sound of her voice, and turned the corner toward the elevator. The 32nd floor was not his problem. The following Thursday, Ray's shift started 4 hours early. His supervisor had called that morning. There was an event on the 32nd floor, a cocktail reception for some visiting executives. They needed extra hands, clearing glasses, wiping down surfaces, restocking the bar. Ray would be paid time and a half. He said yes because time and a half meant new shoes for Sophia before winter. He arrived at the Bellinger Shaw Tower at 6 in the evening. The building felt different during business hours. Voices carried through open doors. Phones rang. The elevators moved constantly, packed with people who looked through him on their way to somewhere important. The 32nd floor had been transformed. The long conference table had been pushed against the wall and draped in white linen. A temporary bar stood in the far corner, staffed by 2 bartenders in black vests. Trays of small food lined the credenza shrimp on tiny plates, cheese he couldn't name, bread cut into circles. The overhead lights had been dimmed. Floor lamps cast the room in a warm amber glow that made the leather furniture look like it belonged in a magazine. Ray pulled on a fresh uniform in the service closet. Gray shirt, gray pants. his name stitched over the pocket in thread that had started to fray. By 7, the room was full. 40, maybe 50 people. Senior partners in tailored suits, board members with drinks already in hand. 2 journalists from a local business publication stood near the windows, one taking photos. And near the center of it all, a group of 5 men and 2 women who spoke to each other in Portuguese. The delegation from Grupo Santerra, the Sao Paulo-based conglomerate that everyone in the building had been whispering about for weeks. Catherine Bellinger moved through the room like she owned the air in it. Tall, sharp-jawed, a charcoal dress that probably cost more than Ray made in a month. She shook hands firmly. She laughed at the right moments, but Ray could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she kept glancing at the Brazilian delegation, measuring their reactions, tracking who was smiling and who wasn't. They weren't smiling much. Ray stayed at the edges. He collected empty glasses from windowsills and side tables, wiped rings from the wood, replaced cocktail napkins. He moved the way he always moved in this building, quietly, efficiently, like furniture that happened to have legs. Near the bar, one of the Brazilian executives, a broad-shouldered man with silver hair and a blue pocket square, set his glass on the edge of a high table. It caught the rim wrong. Red wine tilted, tipped, and spilled across the white tablecloth and onto the floor, splashing the cuff of the man's trousers. The man stepped back. A small circle of people turned to look. "Someone clean this up," Catherine said. She didn't look for who. She just said it, the way a person talks to the walls when they expect the walls to answer. Ray was already moving. He crossed the room with a cloth and a small spray bottle from his cart. He knelt beside the table and began wiping the floor, working the stain out of the marble in quick, practiced circles. Catherine was mid-sentence with one of the Grupo Santerra executives. Her voice was bright, but strained. The Brazilian team had been polite all evening and nothing more. Polite, in a deal like this, meant no. She looked down at Ray on his knees. Something shifted in her expression. A flicker of frustration redirected, aimed at the nearest available target. "You know what?" she said, loud enough that conversations nearby paused. "Maybe I've been negotiating with the wrong people." She turned to her senior staff with a performer's timing. Then she looked down at Ray again and spread her hands wide, as if presenting him to the room. "Close this $900 million deal for me, and I'll marry you." Laughter. Sharp and immediate. It rippled through the Bellinger-Shaw side of the room, partners, associates, board members. A release valve for weeks of tension, aimed squarely at the man on his knees with a rag in his hand. The Brazilian delegates did not laugh. The silver-haired man with the spilled wine looked at the floor. One of the women from Sao Paulo pressed her lips together and turned away. Ray's hand stopped moving. Just for a second. 1 second where his grip tightened on the cloth and the muscles in his forearm went rigid. Then he finished wiping. He stood. He picked up the stained tablecloth and folded it over his arm. He walked out of the room without looking at anyone. The laughter had already moved on. Catherine was back in conversation. The room refilled with noise. One of the journalists lowered her phone. She'd been recording. At the far end of the conference table, Helen Park sat with a glass of water she hadn't touched. She was the only person still looking at the door where Ray had left. She wasn't laughing. She wasn't smiling. She was watching the empty doorway with an expression that looked almost like recognition. Ray finished his shift without speaking. He cleaned the remaining floors mechanically, hands moving, mind somewhere else. He clocked out at 11. Caught the bus, rode it in silence. The apartment was dark except for the living room lamp. Mrs. Delgado had gone home. Sophia was supposed to be in bed. She wasn't. She sat on the couch in her pajamas, legs pulled up, chin on her knees. She looked up when he came in. "Hi, Papa." "Hey, mija, why are you still up?" "Couldn't sleep." He hung his jacket on the hook by the door, sat down beside her. She studied his face the way she sometimes did carefully, like she was reading something written in a language she was still learning. "How was work?" she asked. "Fine," he said. "Same as always." She didn't answer. On the coffee table, next to her colored pencils, lay a drawing. A skyscraper, taller than any she'd drawn before. She'd used every shade of blue she had. Sophia looked at the drawing. Then she looked at her father's face. She picked up the drawing, folded it once, and slid it into the drawer of the coffee table. It was the first time she hadn't given him the building. Ray didn't sleep that night. Or the next. He lay on the couch with the television off, staring at the ceiling while the apartment settled around him. The refrigerator hummed. A pipe knocked somewhere in the wall. Through the thin curtain, the streetlight threw a pale orange stripe across the floor. Saturday morning, Mrs. Delgado knocked at 8. Sophia had art class at the community center 3 blocks east. Ray had her bag packed by the door: sketch pad, pencil case, the blue sweater she liked because it had a pocket big enough for her eraser. He kissed her forehead. She looked at him for a moment longer than usual, then followed Mrs. Delgado down the stairs. The apartment went quiet. Ray stood in the hallway outside his bedroom closet. He hadn't opened the top shelf in over a year, maybe longer. A shoebox sat behind a stack of old towels pushed to the back where it couldn't be seen unless you were looking for it. He pulled it down, set it on the bed. The cardboard was soft at the corners from being moved so many times. New York to a storage unit to Chicago, Chicago apartment to apartment. Always the same box, always sealed, always carried. He lifted the lid. On top lay an ID badge, Mercer Klein, New York. The photo showed a younger man, sharper jaw, fuller face, eyes that looked directly at the camera like they expected something from it. The name read Ramon Castillo Vega, Senior Partner, Cross-Border Advisory. Beneath the badge, a newspaper clipping in a thin black frame. The Wall Street Journal, 2015. The headline called him the youngest partner in Mercer Klein's 100-year history. The photo showed him at a conference table in a room with floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan behind him. He was 31 in that picture. He looked like someone who had never lost. At the bottom of the box, under a folded soap tie he hadn't worn since the funeral, was a photograph, not framed, just a 4x6 print with a crease down the middle from being held too many times. Anna. She was in a hospital bed. Her dark hair was thinner than it should have been, pulled to one side. A tube ran from her wrist to a bag on a metal stand. She was smiling. Not a big smile. She didn't have the strength for that by then. But her eyes were warm, and her hand rested on the blanket like she'd just set something down. Like she'd just let something go. He remembered the day this photo was taken. 3 weeks before the end. Sophia was in the hallway with a nurse, eating animal crackers from a paper cup. Anna had asked him to close the door. "You're going to disappear after this," she'd said. Not a question. He hadn't answered. Don't disappear, Ray. But he had. The week after Anna died, he resigned from Mercer Klein. No transition, no explanation his colleagues found satisfying. He was the man who had closed the Braga Port Authority deal in 72 hours. The man who restructured a collapsing German-Brazilian mining merger that 14 other advisors had walked away from. He spoke 3 languages at a negotiation table and could read a room in any culture on Earth. And then he was gone. He packed 2 suitcases, one for him, one for Sophia, who was 3 and kept asking where Mama went. He moved to Chicago because nobody in Chicago would look for Ramon Castillo Vega. He dropped the Vega, shortened the Ramon, applied for a custodial position at a commercial real estate firm, then another, then Bellinger Shaw. The uniform fit, the hours worked. Nobody asked him anything, and he returned the favor. 5 years. That's how long a man can live inside a smaller version of himself if he practices every single day. Ray put the photograph of Ana back in the box. He placed the badge on top of it. He closed the lid. The front door opened at 11. Sophia came in with her sketchpad under her arm. Mrs. Delgado waved from the hallway and pulled the door shut behind her. Sophia set her bag down. She didn't go to the kitchen table. She didn't pull out her pencils. She stood in the middle of the living room and looked at her father, who was sitting on the couch with his hands on his knees. "Papa, how was class?" he said. "Fine." She paused. Lily's mom showed Lily a video. "From your work." Ray's fingers pressed into his kneecaps. "What video?" "A lady said something mean to you at a party. Lily's mom works at a bank or something, and someone sent it to her." The clip. The journalist's phone. Ray kept his voice level. "It wasn't a big deal, mija. Just a joke." It didn't look like a joke. He opened his mouth to say something else. Something easy and reassuring, the kind of sentence a parent builds to hold the weight so the child doesn't have to. But Sophia spoke first. "Papa, you always tell me to be brave." 6 words. Spoken quietly, the way she said everything, simply, directly, without knowing that the sentence had a second meaning her father could hear and she could not. Ray looked at his daughter. His hands were still on his knees. He had no answer. None that he could give her. None that wouldn't require opening a box much larger than the one on his bed. The refrigerator hummed. The street light outside had given way to midday sun, pale and thin through the curtain. Sophia waited. Her father said nothing. Monday morning, the 32nd floor smelled like cold coffee and panic. Ray could always tell how bad things were by what people left behind. Good weeks meant clean desks, empty trash cans, maybe a takeout container or two. Bad weeks meant paper, printed emails, draft after draft of the same document, each one marked up in a different color pen and thrown away. This was the worst week he'd seen in 5 years. He started his shift at 10 and found Garrett Walsh's office buried. Balled-up printouts covered the desk. A whiteboard on the wall had been erased and rewritten so many times the surface was stained with ghostly columns of numbers. 3 coffee cups sat in a row, each one cold, each one half full. The man had been cycling through cups without finishing any of them. Ray emptied the trash. He wiped the desk. He collected the cups. And he read the paper on the way to the bin. He couldn't help it. The documents passed through his hands every night. Term sheets, regulatory filings, draft frameworks, stamped confidential in red ink. Most of the staff shredded sensitive material. Walsh's team was too overwhelmed to bother. They crumpled it and tossed it and assumed the man who picked it up couldn't read. Ray read all of it. The Grupo Santerra deal was dying. He could see it the way a mechanic can hear a bad engine. Not one thing wrong, but everything slightly off. The whole structure vibrating toward failure. The merger framework Bellinger Shaw had proposed required Brazilian regulatory approval under a model that didn't account for foreign ownership thresholds. The equity split was wrong. The timeline was wrong. The compliance structure assumed American rules applied to Brazilian markets. They didn't. Ray knew this because he'd done deals like this before. Deals exactly like this. In a different life, under a different name, he'd built frameworks across 3 continents and never once gotten the regulatory architecture wrong. He moved to the next office. Then the next. On Tuesday night, Catherine Bellinger's corner office told a different kind of story. Her desk was spotless. She never left clutter for the cleaning staff. But the conference room adjacent to her office had been used for a meeting that ran late. Ray found printed board correspondence in the recycling bin. A memo from the chairman, 2 paragraphs long. The first paragraph acknowledged Catherine's leadership over the past decade. The second warned that failure to close the Grupo Santerra deal would trigger a formal leadership review. The language was polite. The meaning was not. Ray put the memo in the recycling bag and tied it shut. Down the hall, lights were still on. Through the glass wall of the strategy room, he could see Garrett Walsh and 4 associates hunched over laptops. Walsh was talking fast, gesturing at a projection on the wall. One of the associates rubbed her eyes. Another stared at the table like it owed him money. They were trying to restructure the ownership model. Ray could see the projection from the hallway. They were closer than they knew, but they built it on the wrong regulatory baseline. Everything above that foundation was going to crack. He kept walking. Wednesday night was the worst. Walsh's team had been in the building for 36 hours straight. The trash cans were overflowing. The carpet smelled like fast food and dry erase markers. Someone had punched a fist-shaped dent in the wall near the copy room. Catherine had responded to the crisis the way she always did, by tightening her grip. Ray found a printed email chain in which she'd canceled the firm's contract with an outside regulatory consultant. "Too expensive," she'd written. "We handle this in-house." Another email showed her rejecting a request from Walsh to bring in a specialist from their London office. The subject line read, "We don't need outside help. We need results." Ray emptied the last trash can on the 31st floor. He pulled his cart into the service elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. The doors closed. He stood still for a moment. Then he pulled a paper napkin from his back pocket and a pen from the cart's supply tray. He smoothed the napkin against the elevator wall and wrote, small, precise handwriting, 3 lines of notes. A corrected regulatory baseline, a revised ownership threshold, and a reference to a Brazilian compliance framework that Walsh's team had clearly never heard of. The elevator reached the lobby. Ray looked at the napkin. He folded it once, crumpled it, dropped it in the trash can beside Walsh's office door on his way back through the floor. It was a reflex. Write it down, throw it away. The way a retired athlete might shadowbox in an empty room and then stop, embarrassed, before anyone sees. At midnight, Helen Park walked out of her office on the 32nd floor. She'd been working late every night that week, running the numbers on what a failed deal would cost the firm. 212 jobs. That was the number she kept coming back to. Not the partners they'd survive. The analysts, the assistants, the interns, the custodial staff. She passed Walsh's office on the way to the elevator. The crumpled napkin sat on top of the trash, visible in the dim hallway light. Helen almost walked past it, but something caught her eye. The handwriting was too neat, too structured, too deliberate for a scribbled note. She pulled it from the bin and unfolded it. 3 lines. A corrected regulatory baseline. A revised ownership threshold. A citation of Brazilian compliance law so specific it included the clause number. Helen read it twice. Her lips parted. She read it a 3rd time. The notes were correct. Not approximately correct. Not in the right direction. They were precisely, exactly, inarguably correct. The kind of analysis that should have come from a senior regulatory specialist, not a trash can on the 31st floor. She folded the napkin carefully and slipped it into her jacket pocket. Then she walked down the hall to the security desk, where Eddie sat reading a paperback novel. "Eddie," she said, "the janitor who works this floor. What's his full name?" Helen sat at her kitchen table Thursday evening with the napkin smoothed flat under the desk lamp. She'd taken a photo of it on her phone, but the photo didn't capture what mattered: the precision of the handwriting. Small, even letters. No hesitation marks, no crossed-out words. Whoever wrote this had not been guessing. They'd been remembering. She typed Ray Castillo into a search engine. Nothing useful. A youth soccer coach in Tampa. A real estate agent in El Paso. No one who matched a janitor in Chicago who could cite Brazilian regulatory clause numbers from memory. She tried Ray Castillo Finance. Nothing. Ray Castillo Mercer Klein. Nothing. The napkin sat under the lamplight. 3 lines of notes that could save a $900 million deal, written by a man who pushed a mop cart for $12 an hour. Helen leaned back in her chair. The kitchen was quiet. Her daughter was asleep upstairs. Her husband was traveling for work. The only sound was the tick of the wall clock and the low drone of the dishwasher finishing its cycle. She kept coming back to one thing. Not the notes themselves, but the feeling they gave her. She'd seen analysis like this before. Once. In 2014, when she was a junior controller at a small boutique advisory firm called Leland & Worth. The firm had been drowning, a failed acquisition had left them overexposed, and the bank was calling in lines of credit. They were 90 days from insolvency. Then a restructuring proposal arrived. No meeting, no presentation, just a document routed through Mercer Klein's cross-border division that dismantled their entire debt structure and rebuilt it in a way that no one at Leland & Worth had imagined was possible. The proposal saved the firm. Helen had kept her job. 30 other people had kept theirs. She'd never met the advisor who wrote it. The engagement letter listed only an initial and a last name, R. Castillo Vega. Helen opened her laptop again. She typed, Castillo Vega Mercer Klein. The Wall Street Journal article loaded in half a second. The headline was from 2015. The photo showed a young man at a conference table, dark hair, sharp eyes, suit that fit like it had been cut for him. He looked like someone who belonged in rooms where decisions were made. The article called him the youngest partner in Mercer Klein's 100-year history. It listed 3 landmark deals. It used the phrase cross-border specialist 4 times. Helen looked at the photo. Then she looked at the image she held in her mind, the janitor on the 32nd floor. Same build, same jaw. Older, quieter, worn down in the way that years of invisible work wear a person down. But the same man. She closed the laptop at midnight. She didn't sleep well. Friday morning, the deal got worse. Grupo Santerra's legal team sent a formal communication at 9 a.m., 72 hours, resolve the outstanding regulatory and structural objections, or the deal was dead. No extension, no further discussion. Ricardo Menezes had signed it personally. By noon, a financial blog published a leaked internal memo from Bellinger Shaw's board chairman expressing concern about the firm's leadership and direction. Catherine's name wasn't mentioned. It didn't need to be. The comments section did the work for them. Catherine spent the afternoon behind closed doors. Her assistant canceled 3 meetings. Garrett Walsh sat in the strategy room with his team, staring at the same whiteboard they'd been staring at for a week. Helen watched it all from her office. The napkin was in her jacket pocket. The Wall Street Journal article was bookmarked on her phone. 212 jobs. She waited until 10,030 that night. Ray's shift started at 10. She found him on the 30th floor, vacuuming the hallway outside the partner's offices. The sound of the machine covered her footsteps. She waited until he turned it off to move to the next section. Ray. He looked up. His face was neutral, patient. The face of a man who expected to be asked about a spill or a broken light. "I know who you are," Helen said. Something shifted behind his eyes. A door closing. "I don't know what you mean," he said. "Ramon Castillo Vega, Mercer Klein, the Braga Port Authority deal, the German-Brazilian mining restructure." She kept her voice low. "You saved my firm in 2014. Leland and Worth. I was there." Ray's hand tightened on the vacuum handle. His knuckles went pale. "You have the wrong person," he said. 212 people work here, Ray. Analysts, assistants, mailroom staff, people on the custodial team. Your team. If this deal collapses, half of them lose their jobs inside of 6 months. The hallway was empty. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Somewhere below them, the building's ventilation system exhaled a low, steady hum. Ray looked at her for a long moment. Then he shook his head. "I can't help you," he said. "I'm sorry." He turned the vacuum back on. Helen stood there for another few seconds. Then she turned and walked to the elevator. She pressed the button. The doors opened. She stepped inside and descended alone. Ray finished his shift at 6 in the morning. He rode the bus home. Mrs. Delgado was asleep in the recliner. Sophia was in bed with the blanket pulled to her chin and the photo of Anna on the nightstand beside her. He stood in the kitchen. The fridge was covered in drawings, dozens of skyscrapers, layer upon layer, some old enough that the tape had yellowed. All those buildings she kept giving him. All those towers she believed he would own. Except one. The one she'd put in the drawer. He stood there a long time. The apartment was still. The first gray light of morning came through the curtain. He could hear Sophia breathing in the other room, slow, steady, trusting. He thought about Anna, what she would say if she could see him now. He already knew. He'd always known. He picked up his phone and dialed Helen's number. She answered on the second ring. She hadn't been sleeping either. "Show me everything," Ray said. Helen had spent Friday night and all of Saturday morning preparing. She printed the deal documents Ray had asked to see, smuggled them out of the office in her bag, and met him at a diner 6 blocks from the tower at midnight. He read for 4 hours. He didn't take notes. He didn't need to. By Saturday at noon, the emergency session was set. 48 hours remained on Grupo Santerra's ultimatum. Catherine had called it herself one final attempt to present a revised framework before the deadline expired. Garrett Walsh and his team would lead. The Brazilian delegation would attend in a hybrid format. Ricardo Menezes and his CFO in person. Legal counsel and advisory staff connected by video link from Sao Paulo. Helen had one job: get Ray into the room. She called the facilities manager that morning and reported an intermittent electrical issue in the 32nd floor conference room, a flickering outlet near the projection screen. She requested that maintenance send someone to stand by during the session in case the system failed. The facilities manager sent the name that was on the Saturday shift roster: Ray Castillo, janitor. Available. He arrived at the 32nd floor at 1:45 p.m. in his gray uniform, carrying a small toolbox Helen had asked facilities to provide. He positioned himself near the back wall, beside the AV cabinet, where the outlet in question was located. He knelt down, opened the toolbox, and waited. The room filled. Garrett Walsh took the head of the table, flanked by 2 associates and a paralegal. Catherine sat to his right, her posture rigid, her fingers wrapped around a pen she didn't use. Helen took a seat at the far end, near the screen. The Brazilian delegation arrived at 2. Menezes entered first, a tall man with silver-streaked hair and a calm, measuring gaze. His CFO followed. They shook hands with Catherine. The handshakes were brief, no warmth. On the wall-mounted screen, 4 additional faces appeared from Sao Paulo legal counsel, 2 regulatory advisors, and a man in a dark suit whose name placard read Lawrence Fenton, Mercer Klein Advisory. Ray, kneeling by the wall, did not look at the screen. He kept his eyes on the toolbox. Garrett began his presentation. He walked through the revised merger framework slide by slide. He spoke confidently. He used the right terminology. But Ray could hear the hollow places, the points where Garrett's voice accelerated slightly because he didn't fully understand what he was saying. The regulatory model was still wrong. The ownership threshold hadn't been adjusted. The compliance architecture was built on assumptions that wouldn't survive the first round of Brazilian regulatory review. Menezes listened without expression. His CFO took no notes. 20 minutes in, Garrett finished. He turned to the Brazilian delegation. "We believe this revised framework addresses the core structural concerns your team raised," he said. Menezes was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he leaned forward. "It does not," he said. His English was precise. The ownership model you've proposed still exceeds the foreign participation threshold under our regulatory code. This is the same problem we identified 3 weeks ago. Nothing has changed. Catherine's pen tapped twice against the table. She looked at Garrett. Garrett looked at his associates. One of them opened a laptop and began scrolling. The silence stretched. Helen watched Catherine's jaw tighten. She watched Menezes glance at his CFO, a small look that said what both of them were thinking. This was over. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Outside the windows, the Chicago skyline sat gray and flat under a low winter sky. Helen spoke. Garrett, can you walk us through how the revised ownership model accounts for the specific thresholds in the Brazilian foreign investment framework? I want to make sure we're aligned on the exact percentages. Garrett blinked. He looked at his laptop. He looked at his associate. The associate shook her head slightly. We're working from the general framework, Garrett said. The specific thresholds are something we plan to address in the implementation phase. The silence that followed was the kind that ends things. Menezes placed both hands flat on the table, the gesture of a man about to stand. Then a voice came from the back of the room. The threshold is 49%. Every head turned. Ray stood beside the AV cabinet. His hands were at his sides. His voice was level, unhurried, and clear. Brazilian regulatory code caps foreign ownership participation at 49% for infrastructure-class assets. Your current model proposes a 62% equity stake for Bellinger Shaw. That's why the framework keeps failing. The math doesn't work because the structure was never designed to work under Brazilian law. The room went still. Catherine's pen stopped moving. "What are you doing?" she said. Her voice was low, controlled. A warning. Ray didn't look at her. He looked at Menezes. "There's a compliant path," Ray said. "A tiered ownership model with a Brazilian majority holding entity as the primary acquirer. Bellinger Shaw retains operational control through a management services agreement, while the equity structure satisfies the 49% cap. It protects both sides." He paused. Then he shifted languages. The Portuguese came out the way water moves through a channel it already knows, smooth, natural, without effort. He spoke directly to Menezes and the São Paulo team on the screen. He outlined the tiered structure in detail. He referenced specific regulatory provisions by number. He described how the management services agreement could be structured to preserve Bellinger Shaw's decision-making authority without triggering a reclassification. Menezes leaned back in his chair. His CFO picked up a pen for the first time all afternoon. On the video screen, the legal counsel from São Paulo removed his glasses and leaned closer to the camera. Catherine stood. "This man is a custodial worker," she said. "He has no authority to speak in this room. I want him removed. Now." Menezes raised one hand. He didn't look at Catherine. "The first would like to hear the rest," he said. Then, in Portuguese, he asked the question that changed everything. "Quem é você?" "Who are you?" Ray answered in Portuguese. 4 words, his real name. The name he hadn't spoken aloud in 5 years. "Meu nome é Ramon Castillo Vega." The name hung in the air. Ramon Castillo Vega. No one in the room moved. Catherine recovered first. "The first don't care what name he gives himself," she said. "He's a janitor. He has no credentials, no clearance, and no right to be addressing this delegation. I want him out of this room, now." She looked at Garrett. Garrett didn't move. She looked at her associates. They stared at the table. Menezes spoke without turning to face her. "Ms. Bellinger, with respect, your team has had 3 weeks to resolve these issues and has failed. This man has offered more in 2 minutes than I've heard in a month." He gestured toward Ray. "I want to hear the rest." Catherine's mouth opened. Nothing came out. She sat down. The air conditioning hummed. Outside the windows, a low winter sun cut through the clouds and threw a pale stripe across the conference table. Ray stepped forward. Not to the head of the table, he stopped 2/3 of the way down, standing between the two sides. He didn't ask for a laptop. He didn't ask for a screen. He spoke from memory. He took the first structural objection, the ownership threshold, and walked both sides through the tiered model in detail. He described how a Brazilian majority holding entity would serve as the primary acquiring body, with Bellinger Shaw retaining operational authority through a management services agreement. He cited the specific regulatory provisions that governed foreign participation limits and explained how the tiered structure remained compliant under each one. Then he moved to the second objection: tax liability. The merger framework assumed a consolidated tax treatment that Brazilian law didn't permit for cross-border infrastructure assets. Ray proposed a dual-entity structure that separated the tax obligations while keeping the operational chain intact. He referenced a precedent, a German-Brazilian mining deal from 2016 that had used a similar model and survived 3 rounds of regulatory review. Menezes's CFO was writing fast. The legal counsel on the video link had unmuted his microphone and was leaning forward, nodding. Ray addressed the third objection: timeline. Grupo Santerra had insisted on a phased implementation that Bellinger Shaw's original framework didn't accommodate. Ray proposed a 3-stage closing sequence with built-in regulatory checkpoints at each phase, allowing both sides to pause and adjust without triggering breach clauses. He spoke in English when the concepts were structural. He shifted to Portuguese when he addressed the São Paulo team directly when the details were specific to Brazilian law, or when he needed Menezes to understand not just the words, but the intent behind them. On the video screen, the man in the dark suit, Lawrence Fenton, Mercer Klein Advisory, had gone very still. His eyes were fixed on Ray, not on what Ray was saying, on how he was saying it, the rhythm, the precision, the way he moved between languages without pausing, without translating, as if both existed in his mind at the same level. Fenton had seen this before, years ago, in a conference room in Frankfurt, and another in Lisbon, and another on the 44th floor of a building in Lower Manhattan that he passed every day on his way to work. Ray finished outlining the third objection and paused. He was about to address the fourth when a voice came through the speakers. "Ramon, one word, quiet." Almost a whisper. Every head in the room turned toward the screen. Lawrence Fenton leaned closer to his camera. His face had changed. The professional composure was gone. He looked like a man seeing a ghost. "Ramon Castile Vega," Fenton said. "My God." Ray looked at the screen. He didn't speak. Fenton turned to address the room. His voice was steady but heavy with something that went beyond surprise. This man was a senior partner at Mercer Klein. He was the best cross-border closer our firm has ever produced. He structured the Braga Port Authority acquisition in 2014. He closed the Heller Nascimento mining restructure in 2016, a deal that 14 other advisory firms had abandoned. Fenton paused. He disappeared in 2017. No one knew where he went. We assumed he'd gone to a competitor. The room was still. Menezes looked at Ray with new eyes, not just interest now, but recognition. The Braga Port Authority deal was legendary in Brazilian financial circles. Every senior executive in São Paulo knew the name attached to it. Garrett Walsh stared at his laptop screen. Then, slowly, he closed it. He folded his hands on top of it and said nothing. Catherine stood at the far end of the table. Her arms were crossed. Her face was blank, not composed, but empty, the way a face goes when the mind behind it is processing something it cannot yet accept. The man in the gray uniform. The man on his knees with a rag. The man she had turned into a punchline in front of 50 people and a journalist with a camera. That man was now saving her career. And everyone in the room knew it. The session continued for 3 more hours. Ray worked through the remaining objections one by one. He proposed contractual language. He suggested amendment provisions. He answered questions from the Sao Paulo legal team in Portuguese and from Bellinger Shaw's associates in English, shifting between the two without effort, without notes, without once raising his voice. By 5 o'clock, Menezes and his CFO were nodding. The legal counsel on the screen had stopped interrupting not because he disagreed, but because there was nothing left to challenge. The revised framework addressed every structural objection Grupo Santera had raised. Menezes stood. He extended his hand across the table, not to Catherine, not to Garrett, but to Ray. "We'll take the revised framework to our board," he said. "I believe we have a path forward." Ray shook his hand, one firm grip. Then he stepped back. Catherine hadn't moved from her position at the end of the table. She watched Ray walk toward the door. She didn't speak. Her pen lay on the table where she'd set it down 3 hours ago. She hadn't picked it up once. Ray reached the door. He paused. His hand went to the Bellinger Shaw ID badge clipped to his shirt, the one with his photo and his name, Ray Castile, custodial staff. He unclipped it, held it for a moment. Then he dropped it into the trash can beside the door. The badge landed with a soft plastic sound against the empty liner. Ray walked out. He didn't look back. Somewhere across town, the journalist who had filmed Catherine's joke at the cocktail reception 3 weeks earlier felt her phone vibrate. An anonymous text. 4 sentences. No name attached. She read it twice. Then she opened her laptop. The article went live on Monday morning. The journalist, her name was Nina Cortez, and she covered Chicago's financial sector for the Tribune's business desk, had spent Sunday writing. She had the original clip from the cocktail reception, the one she'd recorded on her phone 3 weeks ago. She had the anonymous tip about what happened in the conference room on Saturday. And she had 2 sources inside Bellinger Shaw willing to confirm, off the record, that a custodial worker had restructured a $900 million deal in front of both negotiating teams. The headline was simple. The story was not. By Tuesday afternoon, the clip had been viewed 2 million times. By Wednesday, it was on national news. The format was always the same. The original video of Catherine's joke played first, followed by a summary of what happened 3 weeks later. Comment sections filled with thousands of responses. The phrase, "close this deal for me," became a punchline repeated across social media. But the joke was no longer aimed at the janitor. It was aimed at the woman who had made it. Ray's phone rang 14 times on Tuesday. He answered none of them. He unplugged it from the wall and put it in a kitchen drawer. Sophia asked why. "Too many wrong numbers," he said. She didn't believe him. He could tell by the way she looked at the drawer. But she let it go. Wednesday, a letter arrived, not in the mail hand delivered by a courier to Ray's apartment building. The envelope was heavy cream stock with the Bellinger Shaw logo embossed in the corner. Inside was a single page from the firm's legal department. The letter accused Ray of unauthorized access to proprietary deal information. It cited 3 clauses from his employment contract. It demanded a formal response within 10 business days and warned that failure to comply would result in civil litigation seeking damages and injunctive relief. Ray read it at the kitchen table. The paper was thick and smooth between his calloused fingers. He read it twice. Then he set it down and stared at the wall. He couldn't afford a lawyer. His savings account held enough for 3 months of rent and groceries. A legal fight against Bellinger Shaw's attorneys would cost more than he'd earned in the past 2 years combined. That afternoon, Catherine Bellinger held a press conference. She stood behind a podium in the firm's lobby, the same marble lobby Ray had walked through every night for 5 years. She wore a navy suit. Her voice was measured, rehearsed. She told the cameras that a disgruntled employee had accessed confidential deal materials without authorization and inserted himself into a sensitive negotiation through deception. She said the firm was reviewing all security protocols. She did not mention Ray's name. She did not need to. The firm's PR team pushed the narrative hard. Background quotes appeared in 2 financial publications by Thursday, painting Ray as an opportunist who had manipulated his way into the room to embarrass his employer. Ray sat in his apartment and watched the walls close in. Then, Thursday evening, the walls stopped. Lawrence Fenton released a statement through Mercer Klein's communications office. It was 4 paragraphs long. It confirmed that Ramon Castillo Vega had been a senior partner at the firm from 2010 to 2017. It described his track record: 3 landmark cross-border closings, a specialization in regulatory architecture, a reputation that was still referenced in the industry 8 years after his departure. The final paragraph stated that Fenton had personally witnessed Ray's intervention in the Grupo Santerra negotiation, and that the deal would have collapsed without his expertise. The statement didn't mention Catherine. It didn't need to. Friday morning, Ricardo Menezes sent a letter of his own addressed to Bellinger Shaw's board of directors. The letter stated that Grupo Santerra viewed the revised framework as viable solely because of the restructuring proposed by Ramon Castillo Vega. It further stated that any legal action against the individual responsible for saving the deal would cause Grupo Santerra to reconsider the partnership entirely. $900 million. That was the weight behind Menezes' letter. That was the number that made Bellinger Shaw's legal department go quiet. Inside the firm, Helen Park walked into the board chairman's office on Friday afternoon and closed the door. She carried a folder. Inside the folder was a 3-year record of internal performance reports that contradicted every public statement Catherine had made about the firm's trajectory. Declining margins. Missed targets. 2 failed acquisitions buried in footnotes. Helen set the folder on the chairman's desk. "If legal action moves forward against Ray Castillo," she said, "I resign tomorrow, and I take this to the Tribune on my way out." The board met that evening. The meeting lasted 2 hours. When it ended, 2 things had happened. The legal threats against Ray were formally withdrawn, and Catherine Bellinger was removed as co-CEO. Not for the humiliation, not for the viral clip, but for the years of concealed dysfunction that the board review finally brought to light. Ray learned about it Saturday morning. Helen called him. She kept it brief. The legal matter was closed. Catherine was out. The deal was proceeding. He thanked her. She told him not to. Then she hung up. Over the following week, 3 firms contacted him. 2 from New York, 1 from London. He read their emails on his phone. He'd plugged it back in and closed them without responding. He wasn't ready. Not yet. Saturday evening, he cooked dinner. Rice and chicken. The same meal, the same kitchen, the same table. Sophia sat across from him. She'd been watching the news on Mrs. Delgado's television. She understood more than she said. She pushed a piece of chicken around her plate. "Papa?" "Yeah, mija. Are we okay?" Ray looked at his daughter. Her serious eyes, her small hands resting on either side of her plate. The photo of Aina on the nightstand in the next room. The drawings on the fridge. All those skyscrapers, all those buildings she believed he'd own. "Yeah," he said. "We're okay." He meant it. 6 months later, Ray still cooked dinner every evening. Rice and chicken, or pasta, or sometimes the black bean soup Sophia had decided was her favorite in January and hadn't gotten tired of yet. The kitchen was the same. The table was the same. The colored pencils still covered half of it, but the drawings had changed. Sophia's skyscrapers still climbed to the top of the page. She still used every shade of blue she owned. But now there were people inside the windows, tiny figures sitting at desks, standing in doorways, waving from balconies. Her art teacher had called Ray in for a conference the month before, not because anything was wrong. She'd wanted to show him Sophia's latest piece. She draws buildings that look like they have stories inside them, the teacher said. Most kids her age draw what things look like. Sophia draws what things feel like. Ray had nodded. He'd thanked the teacher. He'd pinned the drawing to the fridge when he got home. His new office was on the 7th floor of a building 12 blocks south of the Bellinger Shaw Tower. The firm was called Archer Lind, mid-sized, 23 employees, specializing in cross-border infrastructure advisory. They'd contacted him in March, 2 months after the story broke. The managing partner was a woman named Grace Cho, who had read the Tribune article and spent 3 weeks convincing Ray to take a meeting. He'd agreed to a senior advisory role, part-time at first, then full-time by April. His hours were 8 to 4. He was home by 4:30, no night shifts, no gray uniform, no mop cart. The work was familiar, not the same smaller deals, lower stakes, more room to breathe. But the language was the same. The architecture of negotiation, the geometry of compromise, the careful translation between what one side wanted and what the other could accept. His hands remembered it the way a pianist's hands remember a song they haven't played in years. Sophia had made a new friend at school, a girl named Priya who also liked to draw. They spent recess designing buildings together. Priya did the interiors, Sophia did the facades. When Priya's mother had asked what Sophia's father did for work, Sophia answered without hesitating. "He helps companies talk to each other," she said. She didn't hide it anymore. She didn't need to. Across the city, in a rented office on the 14th floor of a building that was not Bellinger Shaw, Catherine Bellinger sat behind a desk that was half the size of her old one. She'd resurfaced in April as an independent consultant. A few former colleagues had sent referrals. The work was smaller, quieter, the kind of work she used to delegate to juniors. On a Tuesday afternoon in May, she found herself watching the clip again. Not the full article, just the original video. The cocktail reception, the spilled wine, the man on his knees. Her voice, bright and sharp, carrying across the room. The laughter. The janitor standing and walking out. She watched it without sound. Just the image. The faces. Her own face confident, performing, completely unaware of what she was setting in motion. She closed the browser tab. She sat still for a long time. The expression on her face was not anger. It was recognition. The slow, hollow understanding of who she had been in that room and what it had cost her. Back on the 7th floor of Archer Lind, a package arrived at Ray's desk one afternoon in June. A bottle of wine, expensive, Italian, the kind Ray had never bought for himself. A handwritten note was tucked inside the tissue paper. "The 32nd floor misses you." Helen Ray set the bottle on the corner of his desk. He kept the note. Helen Park had been named co-CEO of Bellinger Shaw in February. The Grupo Santerra deal closed in March. Ray had read about it in the paper. He'd folded the page and put it in a drawer at home, not the locked box in the closet, just a regular drawer, the kind you open without thinking. On a Saturday in late June, Ray took Sophia to the park, the one by the lake, where the grass met the concrete path and you could see the whole skyline from the right bench. The afternoon sun was warm. A breeze came off the water and moved through the trees. Sophia sat cross-legged on the bench beside him, her sketchpad on her knees. She was drawing again. Ray watched her for a while, the way her tongue pressed to the corner of her lip, the way her hand moved in quick, certain strokes. She was 10 now. Taller. Still small for her age, but growing into something sturdy. He looked at the skyline. All those towers, glass and steel and concrete, stacked against the sky like promises someone made and kept. He'd cleaned one of those buildings for 5 years. He'd worked inside another for the past 3 months. From this bench, they looked the same. He took out his phone, opened the photos, scrolled past dozens of images until he found it, the picture of Anna in the hospital bed. The same one from the shoebox. He'd taken a photo of the photo last winter and kept it on his phone so he wouldn't have to open the box. She was smiling in it. That small, tired smile, her hand resting on the blanket. He looked at it for a moment. The breeze moved through the trees. Sophia's pencil scratched against the paper. Somewhere down the path, a child laughed. "Papa." He looked up. Sophia held the sketch pad toward him. A skyscraper, tall, narrow blue windows from base to roof, and next to it, a small figure. Simple. A circle for a head, a rectangle for a body. In one hand, a stick with a flat end. A mop. In the other hand, a small square shape with a handle. A briefcase. Ray took the drawing. He looked at it for a long time. The figure was small next to the building, but it was standing, both hands full, both feet on the ground. "That's you," Sophia said. He pulled her close, kissed the top of her head, held the drawing carefully, the way you hold something you intend to keep. True power is not the authority you hold over others. It is the mastery you carry quietly within yourself.